To God be the glory.
Welcome back to our study of church history. We are looking at a series of lessons, last lesson and this one, and trying to show how the church and the state became one organization, one unit. We have in past lessons talked about the blending together of the church and state, but they still existed as separate organizations. But during the Middle Ages, what happened was the church and the state, in essence, became one organization. We looked at that from the events that occurred with regard to the rule of Pepin. Then we looked at Charles Martel. We then looked at Pepin the Short. And we're now ready to talk about Charlemagne. With Pepin the Short, remember we saw that the Pope put his sanction upon the king and, in a sense, anointed him, called him the chosen one of God. And in exchange for that, Pepin the Short came back and defended the Roman Catholic Church by driving out the Lombards from the area of Ravenna and gave that land to the Roman Catholic Church. It came to be called Pepin's donation. And at that same time, he made the Pope ruler of the secular realm, so that now then you have the Pope ruling in the church realm and Pope ruling the papal states in a secular realm. And so you see the blending together of one organization. Now the next part or event that played a part in uniting the church and state were the events that took place in the life of Charles the Great, or as we know him, Charlemagne. I want us to study the life of Charlemagne. We're going to look at his life in several different segments. First off, we'll look at him as the man. He lived from 742 until 814. He was king of the Franks from 768 until 814. He was appointed emperor of Rome in the year 800 and served in that capacity from 800 to 814. So you see what happens is the Roman Empire is now restored. It is now called the Holy Roman Empire. And he is going to rule in that capacity until his death. This man accomplished a great number of things. That's the reason he came to be called Charles the Great, or as we know him, Charlemagne. He became a key figure in the development of the Western Europe's medieval civilization. He, through his actions, formed the way Europe operated during this middle period of time in history. Though he lived in the 800s, late 700s, his influence is going to reach for the next 1,000 years. That's the significance of this man, Charlemagne. He was an outstanding man, and we'll look at several of his accomplishments as we see what made this man great. By his almost constant military campaigns, he created a vast empire in the West, which included much of the western part of the old Roman Empire, as well as some new territories. And so he was militarily conquered a great area. He was the first of the Germanic rulers to assume the title of emperor. The empire that he revived lasted in one form or another for 1,000 years. Culturally and politically, he left his mark on the newly rising civilization of the West. Now remember, we mentioned that and the influence in the West, because in the East, from Constantinople over, they did not go through the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was something just for the West. And Charlemagne developed basically the idea of how that Middle Age civilization operated. Probably no ruler of the early Middle Ages better deserves the title of the great than does he. He was an outstanding person. Now we've looked at him as a man. We want now to look at him as the conqueror. 4 areas were successfully annexed during his kingdom by his military strength and might. First, the southern border. In 778, he crossed the Pyrenees Mountains with very minor success. Now the Pyrenees Mountains are those mountains basically between Spain and France. On later expeditions, he drove the Muslims back to the Ebro River and established a frontier area known as the Spanish Mark, or March. Sometimes we see it. Excuse me. It centered around the area of Barcelona. Now the second area of his conquest were in the Bavarian and the Saxons, the last of the independent Germanic tribes. These tribes were continued to be independent, but Charlemagne conquers them. It took 32 campaigns to subdue the pagan Saxons who lived between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers. He then divided Saxony into bishoprics. He built monasteries, and he proclaimed harsh laws against paganism. So his military conquest also had a religious consequence. In a sense, as he conquers militarily, he is spreading Christianity. Here were some of the laws that he enacted when he conquered those areas. He passed the law that said eating meat during Lent was worthy of death. Cremating of the dead, which was an old pagan practice, was worthy of death. Pretending to baptize somebody was also forbidden. So you see, he is evangelizing, he is spreading Roman Catholicism along with his military conquest. Violations of those laws were punishable by death. Now notice, and I want to say again, one of the laws that he mentioned, you notice that he said he forbid the eating of meat during Lent. Now the Bible doesn't speak about Lent. Lent was a Roman Catholic holiday. It was the time connected with Easter, in which there were 40 days in which people were supposed to give up something. That's the way it works today. That voluntarily, to be a good Roman Catholic, you give up something during Lent. Well, he made it mandatory that everybody gave up eating meat during this period of time. The third area of his conquest was the troubled spot on the eastern front. They were constantly being threatened by the Slavs and the Avars, and who were Asiatic nomads who were related to the Huns. And so there was always a problem on the eastern frontier. In 6 campaigns, Charlemagne decimated the Avars and then set up his own military province in the valley of the Danube to guard against any further possible future plundering and attack from the eastern nomads. This was called the Eastern Mark, and later came to be called Austria. And so what we've seen is, we've seen the Spanish mark in which he conquered into Spain. We then see the conquest of the Saxons and the Germanic barbarians in that conquest. And we now see him conquering in the east against these barbaric tribes, and establishes the eastern mark, which later came to be called Austria. His fourth conquest, or area of intervention, he intervened in Italian politics. Now, Charlemagne is going to live up in what we today look at in terms of Germany or France, in that area, but he's going to have his hands in Italian politics later on. The Lombard king invaded again into the Papal States, the Papal territory. Now remember, the Lombards had done that once before. They had conquered Ravenna and the area around it, and Pepin the Short came over the Alps, drove out the Lombards, gave that land to the Catholic Church so that the Pope could rule the Papal States. That was Pepin's donation. Well, we see now in 774, about that period of time, 20 years later, that the Lombards are back. They come in and again attack the Papal territories. At the request of the Pope, Charlemagne came over and defeated the Lombards in 774, and he proclaimed himself king. Now, while in Italy, he cemented his father's alliance with the church at Rome by confirming Pepin's donation. Pepin was his father. His father had given that donation to the Roman Catholic Church. When Charlemagne conquers this area again against the Lombards, he proclaims himself king, and he cements or solidifies this donation or this union between his kingdom and the Roman Catholic Church by reaffirming the donation that his father had made. That first incursion into Italy proved to be the prelude to the one in 800, which resulted in him being coronated as the emperor. So what we have here in 754, he's going to come back in 800 and be anointed as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope needed protection, and Charlemagne needed divine sanction. And so the two blended together with regard to this need that each had. Charlemagne wanted the church to approve it, and the Roman Catholic Church needed the protection that Charlemagne could give. And so what we're looking at, we looked at him as a man. We then looked at him as a military conqueror. He conquered in 4 different areas. He conquered toward the the west, in terms of the Spanish mark. He conquered the Saxons and the Bavarians. He conquered in the east with regard to the east mark, which became Austria. And he conquered to the south when he again drove the Lombards out of the Ravenna area and again reaffirmed and solidified this donation that his father had made to the Roman Catholic Church. Later on, he comes back, and the Pope recognizes him as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Now then, we want to see this man as the emperor. Because of what Charlemagne did for the church in driving the Lombards out, Pope Leo III, that's 759 to 816, placed the Roman imperial crown on his head as Charlemagne knelt before him at St. Peter's Church on Christmas Day of 800. So we have Pope Leo III, who takes this Roman crown, places it on Charlemagne's head there in this sacred place, the St. Peter's Church, on Christmas Day in the year 800. After his Christmas coronation, Charlemagne said that he didn't know that was going to happen, but he lived up to it. Now, he may have known that it was going to happen, but he claims that he didn't. He wrote in his dispatches, Charles, by the will of God, Roman Emperor, Augustus, in the year of our consulship. So the idea is he recognized himself as the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. He had an oath taken to him as Caesar by all of his officers, all of the lay people, and all of the church people. Again, what we're seeing is, you see, we're coming together, the church and the state, into one organization, and at this time it's going to be called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this man, as he became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he sent ambassadors to soothe the anger of the emperor in Constantinople in 812 to acknowledge the Eastern court and their position of him. Now keep in mind, here's what's happened. You see, there's still been this theoretically world rule that is controlled by Constantinople over in the East. But Constantinople has not done a good job of taking care of the West. The West has kind of been left to do its own thing. Well, as it has done its own thing, it now has appointed Charlemagne as emperor. Well, you've got an emperor. It's in Constantinople. And so because of this, Charlemagne is trying to smooth out the idea and to get the people in Constantinople to accept him as the ruler in the Western Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire. The ceremony in St. Peter's demonstrated that the memory of the Roman Empire survived as a vital tradition in Europe ever since Rome had fallen in 476. Look at that. 325 years later, Rome is still looking for an emperor to be the head of their empire. And they have that strong desire to reestablish political unity. And so what was going to happen is we're going to have the blending together of the state and the church in the Holy Roman Empire through the reign of Charlemagne. The coronation also inaugurated a long-standing struggle between the rivalry of the empire and the church. We've mentioned it several times. We'll continue to mention it. We'll give some examples of what occurred and how it occurred later on. But you have now, you see, they want the blending of the church and the state. But at the same time, you have to decide who is in charge. Is the Pope in charge, or is the Emperor in charge? And through the history that comes about following this event, you'll have times when the Emperor is the man in charge. And then at other times, you'll have the time when the Pope is in charge. And the Pope will discipline the Emperor, and he'll cause him to repent. And so there's going to be this struggle back and forth. That's part of the implication of what happened when Charlemagne was coronated as the king of the Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Day of 800. Now, we'll look at the conflict. In medieval theory, church and state were but two aspects of Christendom. The one represents the Christian society to secure spiritual blessings. The other, the same society, united to safeguard justice and human welfare. So you see, what they're looking at is the Holy Roman Empire has one aspect of it as the church to bring about spiritual blessing. On the other side of this same kingdom, you have the secular power, which was supposed to safeguard justice and welfare of the people. Theoretically, the church and state were in harmony, but with each looking at and being involved in a different aspect of mankind's existence. In reality, the Pope and the Emperor were contestants against each other. It wasn't as unified as they wanted it to be, but rather these two positions are going to be in conflict with each other as to who was going to be in charge. The ever-present question was, should the church rule the state or the state control the church? This contest was illustrated on countless fields, large and small, throughout the Middle Ages. And we'll look at some of those as we continue to study the events in church history. Since time depended upon eternity, the papal party believed that the emperor depended upon the pope. You see, I'll say that again. Since time depended upon eternity, the papal party, the pope, the church, believed that the emperor would be submissive to the pope. But since Constantine and Charlemagne revealed that God also ordained the Christian state, the imperial party argued that the emperor was independent of the pope, and if the Holy Father neglected his eternal duties in time, the emperor had the right to correct or control the pope. You can see there are conflicts in the basic philosophies, each thinking he's boss, and that's going to present conflict. Now, as we continue studying the life of Charlemagne, we want to look at him as the ruler. In his lifetime, Charlemagne left no doubt about the sovereignty of his empire. He was the sovereign ruler. He gave Europe the dominant father figure. Everyone within the realm of him answered to him. He was this dominant father figure as a ruler. To solve the problem of supervising local officials, a concern that plagued all of the German rulers, Charlemagne issued an ordinance creating what is called the Missi Dominici, which was called the king's envoys. And what this was is that there were pairs of itinerant officials, usually a bishop and a lay noble, who traveled throughout the realm to check on the local administrations. Even the Pope could not hide from Charles's watchful eye. These two emissaries, secret agents as it were, for Charlemagne, traveled from place to place and made sure that the local governments carried out the laws just like Charlemagne wanted it to be carried out. These same two men could watch the Pope and see if he was doing the things that Charlemagne wanted done. Now then, we want to look at Charlemagne as an educator. This is one of the great pluses in this man's life and in his reign. You see, this period of time is called the Dark Ages because people were illiterate. They couldn't read and write. And as it were, they were dark with regard to understanding and knowledge. Well, Charlemagne wanted to educate his people. And he began something that's going to be continue on for a long time. He wants to educate these people. He fostered the idea of learning. He fostered the idea of the arts. His efforts have prompted historians to speak of this period as the cultural rebirth. You see, he wanted to re-enlighten people. They had lost their enlightenment. They were not educated, not able to read, and he's going to revive the culture among them. In 789, Charlemagne decreed that every monastery must have a school for the purpose of educating boys in singing, arithmetic, and grammar. Every monastery had to have that school. At his own monastery in his capital, the emperor sponsored a school to educate the royal household and to stimulate learning throughout the whole realm. So, in essence, we see he didn't just preach it, he practiced it. He, in this capital, in this monastery of his, decided that we need to educate these people. And so he put it into practice. Now, connected with that is one of the most famous educators of all time. His name was Alcuin, who was an Anglo-Saxon scholar who was in charge of the school. He was given the great task of reviving learning by undertaking the first steps of writing textbooks on grammar, spelling, rhetoric, and logic. This man's responsibility was prepare some materials that can be taught in all of the monasteries. And it has to be in these subjects: grammar, spelling, rhetoric, and logic. This man proclaimed to his students, "Ye lads, whose age is fitted for reading, learn. The years go by like running water. Waste not the teachable days in idleness." And so he was this great educator who wanted to do what he could to educate the people. Charlemagne is the one who brought that about. There were other great educators in those days that from various parts of the empire, which showed great care in fulfilling what Charlemagne wanted done. There was Paul the deacon, who lived from 720 to 795. He was a Lombard, but he was an educator in Charlemagne's effort to educate the people of his society. There was the Frank Inhard, who lived from 770 to 840. He also was a great educator in Charlemagne's effort to educate society. Then there was the Visigoth, and his name was Theodulf, who lived from 760 to 821. He also was an educator in Charlemagne's reign. Under Charlemagne, preaching was encouraged and books of sermons were prepared. You see, Charlemagne did what he could to educate in all areas, both secular and religious. Confession was favored, though it was not yet obligatory. Now, the idea of confession that we're talking about is where one would go to a priest and confess his sins. It was practiced, but it was not demanded at this time. Every Christian was expected to be able to repeat the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed. You see, Charlemagne is doing what he can to educate the people in this period of time. Now it is called the Dark Ages, but Charlemagne began a great education program, and we're going to see this education program continue on throughout the Middle Ages. It's going to be conducted in the monasteries, and these are going to be great centers of learning for the people connected with the church. Charlemagne renewed and extended the metropolitan system, which had been neglected. At the beginning of his reign, there was only one metropolitan in the Frankish kingdom. At the end of his reign, there were 22. These were now generally known as archbishops, a title which goes back to the time of Athanasius, though it had long been loosely used. Now here's the idea. Charlemagne believed that you should have an archbishop, or the other term for that was a metropolitan. Now the archbishop was a man who had several bishops under him. Charlemagne believed in that philosophy, and when he became king, there was only one archbishop in all the Frankish territory. When Charlemagne died, there were 22 of them. And with each of these bishops, or archbishops, they had several bishops under them. Now, in the Carolingian theory, the archbishop was the judge and the disciplinarian officer of the bishops in his province. He possessed powers which the growth of the papal jurisdiction was soon to curtail. So the idea and the philosophy was that the archbishop was the man who had the power. He possessed power, and he was going to use that power. It was also his duty to call frequently synods to consider the religious problems and questions of the day that were in his diocese, the archdiocese, or as it was usually styled, it was in his province. And so Charlemagne, through his education, is going to educate people. He's going to reinstitute the idea of metropolitans or archbishops so that a bishop would have several bishops in his territory. He would be over those bishops. He would be in charge of the discipline. He would be in charge of calling synods to answer questions and problems that might arise in his area. The last point that we want to look at with regard to Charlemagne is kind of an evaluation of his reign. Few historians challenge Charlemagne's claim to greatness as a major constructive figure in world history. Charlemagne made a place in history. Historians recognize the great good that he did. Now, it is true that he had a hand in establishing the Holy Roman Empire. It is true that he had a hand in promoting Catholicism. But when we lay even that aside, we still see Charlemagne as a tremendous leader in the time of the Middle Ages. A second point we will mention about this evaluation: from the new center in the north, rather than on the Mediterranean, he extended Christian civilization throughout Europe. You see, he broadened it. He expanded it everywhere he went. He conquered to the west, he conquered to the east, he conquered to the south, and everywhere he went, he spread Roman Catholicism. A third statement that we might make about his great influence is that after 3 centuries of disorder, he restored a measure of law and order. You see, from the time that Rome fell until Charlemagne reigned, there really was not much order. There was first one king and then another. First one way of doing things and then another. But Charlemagne, being the powerful figure that he was, brought order, law and order, to the realm of this kingdom. And that's the reason we're going to see it as the Holy Roman Empire. A fourth statement in evaluating this man: his patronage of learning left a cultural heritage that later generations could build upon. What he began in those schools were going to be promoted year after year after year. He began to lay the foundation that all people should be educated, and that philosophy is going to carry on. And lastly, the imperial ideal that he revived persisted as a political force in Europe until 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire was terminated by another self-styled emperor called Napoleon Bonaparte. Charlemagne had a tremendous and a long-range effect in the Middle Ages. The events and the circumstances and the programs that he began lasted for 1,000 years until Napoleon Bonaparte came on the scene. The Holy Roman Empire had its power, had its way, and ruled and controlled the world. And that's what we're going to look at, and that's the significance of this uniting of church and state into one body and one organization. Charlemagne was a tremendous part of that happening.